They called her by a number, not a name, not even a nickname. Just a fading chalk mark on a scrap of wood nailed to the wagon that hauled her like cattle across state lines. Clara Mae had once belonged to a family, then to a man, then to 3 more after that. Each time she was traded something else inside her dimmed until she could no longer remember the sound of her own voice. No one wanted a barren woman, no sons, no legacy, no use. What they wanted was obedient silence and skin that could still pass as valuable from a distance. But Clara was no longer even that. By the time she reached Dustwell, Texas, Clara Mae had been passed through so many hands she'd stopped trying to count. Fever had burned her through one winter. Starvation had etched her collarbones into sharp warnings. Her wrists bore the permanent indents of rope, and her eyes, once bright blue like summer cornflowers, had faded into the gray of ash. The sun in Dustwell was not kind. It beat down on the bone-dry land like punishment. The town itself looked like it was waiting to be buried, wooden planks, sagging dust choking the space between buildings, and people moving with the kind of caution that comes from too many bad things happening too fast. The slavers rolled into town at midday, dragging Clara behind the wagon like a sack of forgotten promises. She barely stood her body, too light, too hollow. Her dress clung to her in damp patches, stained by blood sweat and whatever else the road had wrung from her. She coughed once, a dry, rattling thing that echoed louder than the market crowd. "Today's special," the seller barked, voice sharp as broken glass. He was tall, sun-leathered, with eyes that didn't blink often. "A real good deal if you're looking for quiet company. Can't bear no children, but won't talk back neither." People gathered, men with empty eyes, women with curled lips, even children clutching their mother's aprons stared at the figure swaying in the heat. Clara said nothing. Her tongue was cracked, her throat a desert. Inside, she was already elsewhere, in a place where names mattered, where mothers didn't trade their daughters like rusted tools. "We'll start at half the price of a mule," the man shouted. Laughter, then silence. Then someone muttered, "She looks more dead than alive." A few walked away. Some stayed just to see what would happen. And then he stepped forward. Isaac Boone was not a man who liked crowds. He didn't speak much. He hadn't meant to stop at Dustwell for anything more than kerosene and nails. But when he saw her, not the dress, not the dirt, but the way she stood barely upright like a broken fence post refusing to fall, he couldn't look away. He saw something he recognized. A ruin with breath. Without a word, he reached into his coat and pulled out a leather pouch, dropped it on the wooden crate with a thud that cut through the heat like thunder. The seller blinked. "You ain't even gonna look her over." Isaac didn't flinch. "No need. She's used up, broken inside." "You sure?" Isaac looked at Clara. For a moment, their eyes met. Hers flinched. His didn't. "She's still breathing. That's more than you deserve." The seller laughed uneasily. The crowd didn't. The coins were counted. The key to her ankle shackle was tossed without ceremony. "All sales final," the man said. "No refunds." Isaac turned without another word and walked toward his wagon. He didn't check if she followed. For a moment, Clara didn't move. The chain slipped from her ankle like a snake. Her legs trembled. She almost fell. But then she took a step, then another. Each one scraped against memory, against fear, against every time someone said she wasn't worth the dirt under their boots. She didn't know who he was or what he wanted, but for the first time in years she wasn't being sold because someone expected her to produce something. She was simply bought, and that was terrifying, because maybe this time she wouldn't survive it, or maybe she wouldn't have to. And so Clara Mae, nameless to most, walked barefoot through Dustwell's heat, past wagons and whispers, and the ghosts of every woman who'd never gotten out following a man who hadn't asked for anything, not even her name. Clara Mae's first night in Isaac Boone's cabin was nothing like the dusty stillness of the market. Inside, the small rough-hewn structure lantern light flickered against walls of weathered pine. No one spoke at first. Instead, there was the steady creak of floorboards, the hush of wind whispering through the chinks, and Clara's shallow breaths. She realized she hadn't been able to take a full inhale in months. Isaac set a bowl of lukewarm stew on the wooden table. No fanfare, no questions. Clara's fingers trembled as she lifted the spoon. Every taste shocked her salt warmth nourishment. She closed her eyes, allowing herself to believe that someone had prepared food for her, not out of obligation or profit, but out of care. He didn't say a word while she ate. He just let her. And that silence, so different from the harsh echoes of her past, began to erode the walls around her heart. Later, Clara stiffly stripped off her filthy dress. Isaac had provided fresh clothes, simple cotton trousers, and a loose shirt. No fancy fabrics, just dignity. She hesitated when he laid them out, unsure she deserved the gesture. His eyes met hers, steady, unjudging, and she understood in this cabin she had a right to exist. Her hands shook as she washed in a basin of warm water, but Isaac waited on the porch, listening to the soft splash. When she stepped from the cabin, her skin still damp, he handed her a rough blanket and offered a seat near the hearth. Embers glowed red. The heat felt strange, almost safe. Clara wrapped the blanket around herself like armor. "Sleep," Isaac said quietly. He pointed to a cot in the corner, straw-stuffed and covered with a coarse wool blanket. There were no locks on its side, no chains to keep her pinned. Just rest. Clara lay in that bed staring at the low ceiling. Shadows drifted. Memories pressed back. Voices, fists, the clink of coins as she was handed over. For a moment, fear overwhelmed her. Someone would come for her. She would be taken again. But Isaac's promise, unspoken yet solid, held. Morning came slow. Pale light seeped through the single window. Clara rose, stiff and unsure, but she moved forward. Isaac was already at the table, a fresh pot of coffee brewing. Its aroma made tears sting her eyes. She'd almost forgotten such a thing existed. They ate breakfast in companionable silence. Isaac didn't pry. He didn't ask about the fetid wagon or the men who'd bought and sold her before. He simply set another bowl before her. Later that morning, he stepped outside and returned with a ragged bundle of cloth and paper. Clara unwrapped a tattered quilt, a single piece she'd once dreadfully owned. Stitched into it were scraps of denim-faded calico, and at its center a carefully hand-stitched likeness of a blue cornflower, Clara's favorite, a remnant of her childhood garden. The edges were worn, the seams repaired more times than she could count, and at the bottom, in delicate thread, Clara Mae. She pressed her fingers to the stitches as tears slid down her cheeks. Where? How? Isaac's voice was steady. Found it in my mother's things. She helped women in need. I thought you might want to keep it. In that moment, Clara realized she wasn't an object to be traded. She was a person with a history maybe broken, but hers. The quilt connected her to something real, to identity, to belonging. Over the following days, the cabin filled with small sounds of life. Clara learned the rhythm of chores, sweeping the wooden planks, hauling water from the creek, refilling oil in the lantern. Isaac gave no orders. He just showed her what to do. Each task, no matter how mundane, filled her with a muted pride. She felt usefulness again, her muscles waking her mind, organizing her spirit stirring. Isaac never talked about his past, but clarity came in gestures. Firewood stacked the tool shed. He repaired the seedlings he planted by the cabin door. Each act was quiet, deliberate, regenerative. Each seemed to say, I will build, so will you. They shared quiet evenings. Clara hummed folk melodies she barely remembered. Isaac listened. Once he told her about a time he rescued a wounded hawk and nursed it back to flight. Clara realized her soft humming reminded him of that fragile bird, something close to broken, yet very much alive. Slowly, she began to speak too. The first words were halting, but they came. She spoke of a distant orchard where her family once lived, of a younger sister lost somewhere along the trail of her suffering. She spoke of longing. Isaac listened. Her voice, fragile, at first gained resonance. One afternoon, Clara ventured outside with Isaac to gather wild herbs. They walked together along the creek bank. She paused to brush a delicate flower between her fingers. The act itself was an assertion life could exist again. She said its name Yarrow and watched Isaac smile. "You remember," he said softly. Clara didn't answer. It was enough. He nodded, as if understanding everything. They collected what they needed in companionable silence. On the way back, he let her walk ahead, letting her sense of direction guide them home. Back in the cabin, she brewed tea from the herbs they'd picked. As the warmth spread through her lips, she realized this wasn't just tea, this was healing steeped in time. Each night, the cabin became more than a shelter. Walls ceased to feel like confinement. Instead, they held warmth, held memories, held possibilities. Clara realized she hadn't known hope. Now she did. And in that quiet space, a new sound began to grow, a heartbeat. Not just hers, but theirs. The steady rhythm of two broken souls learning to heal. Clara slept long into the night that first week. When she awoke, Isaac was sitting beside her cot. He held a small wooden box. Inside was a single copper coin, a token stamped with a flower around its edge. "I found this in the quilt," he said. "It's yours." She leaned forward, gently touching the coin. Her name was neither on the edges nor chased into the metal, but she felt its weight like a promise. "I don't," Isaac shook his head. "You do." Clara pressed the coin to her heart. For the first time, she believed him. In the quiet of that cabin, the noise wasn't the crack of whips. It wasn't the jeers of buyers. It wasn't the echo of her own trembling lips begging to be worth something. It was the laughter that followed that evening just as daylight fled and the lantern's flame danced on the ceiling beams. It was the song she hummed, the scent of brewed yarrow tea, the snap of broken cinnamon sticks, the laughter of two souls who knew they were beginning to heal. The noise of healing had begun, and soon the world outside would hear it too. It began with smoke, thin white ribbons rising against the distant sky like prayers too late for answering. Clara Mae noticed it first from the vegetable patch behind the cabin where she had been gently coaxing green shoots through dry soil. She paused, wiped the sweat from her brow, and watched the smoke spiral from the hills beyond the ridge. Isaac, she called steady but low. He stepped out from the woodshed axe in hand and followed her gaze. In an instant, the tension in his shoulders spoke louder than any words. He dropped the axe and began moving before she could speak again. Wildfires weren't rare in late summer. The land was parched, the air so dry it cracked the edges of breath. But something in the wind that day felt different, faster, hungrier. By dusk, the sky had turned a feral orange, and a wall of smoke was cresting the ridge like a wave, preparing to drown the earth. Isaac barked orders with quiet urgency, gathering the children, 3 small hearts thudding against his as he carried them one by one to the wagon. Clara moved with purpose, wrapping jars in rags, stuffing blankets and water into a satchel. Her body ached, but her hands never paused. The cabin, their fragile refuge, was not made to withstand flames. Isaac knew it. Clara knew it. But knowing didn't dull the sting as she stood at the edge of the porch, her eyes drinking in every board, every beam, every inch of space that had begun to feel like safety. "Go," Isaac said. lifting the youngest child into the cart. "Take the road east." "What about you?" Clara asked. "I need one more trip to the barn," he said. "The tools." "There's no time," she snapped, startling herself. But he was already running. Clara climbed into the wagon, heart-hammering fingers clenching the reins. The children were silent, huddled together. She turned the mule toward the old trail, but hesitated, glancing back at the cabin one last time. Her chest tightened. And then she saw it, the small blue-covered journal sitting on the porch rail. Lena's journal. The middle child's most precious possession. The last remnant of her mother who had died before Clara ever arrived. In it were drawings, memories, a letter written in a childish scrawl that began with "Dear Mama." Clara didn't think. She leapt from the wagon feet, hitting dry earth, lungs searing with smoke. The sky above was no longer sky, but a mouthful of fire, swallowing oxygen. She reached the porch just as ash began to fall like dirty snow. Her hands grabbed the journal, held it to her chest, and she turned to run. But Isaac was already there, arms outstretched. "What the hell were you doing?" he barked, gripping her shoulders. Clara opened her hand and showed him the journal. No words needed. His face softened. Just a moment. Then he grabbed her wrist and pulled her toward the wagon. Together they drove into the smoke-hung dusk, the mule braying in panic, the children coughing. Clara held the journal close, as if it were still warm from the child's touch. They didn't speak again until they reached the river bend, where the trees thinned and the air grew cooler. Isaac lifted each child down, checking them for burns or fever. Clara moved automatically, her body tired, her soul trembling. Only when the children were curled together beneath a borrowed quilt did she allow herself to cry, quiet, sharp sobs into the crook of her arm. Isaac sat beside her, not touching, but close enough she could feel his breath. "You ran back for a book?" he said softly. "It's not just a book," she whispered. "It's all she has left of her mother." He nodded. "And you're all they have now." The fire raged for 3 days, devouring trees, fences, and finally the cabin itself. When they returned, there was little left but scorched earth and twisted iron. But Clara didn't cry at the sight. Instead, she knelt and sifted through the ashes, her hands blackened, her breath calm. The swing where the children used to play had burned down to rope stumps. The porch had collapsed. The bed, where Clara had dreamed for the first time in years, was now a black outline in the dirt. But beneath a charred window frame, she found something, a wooden carving Isaac had once made, half-cracked, soot-stained but intact. A hawk. She brushed it clean with her sleeve and held it high. Isaac stood beside her, his face a mask of smoke and sorrow. He reached into his pocket and held out a small cloth bundle. Inside, Clara's old copper coin. "I thought it was lost," she murmured. "Wasn't," he replied. "Things worth keeping don't disappear. They just get buried sometimes." Clara looked around at the remnants of their lives. The children had made a circle of stones by the creek, building something small, while the adults faced ruin. Clara's breath hitched. They would rebuild. It wouldn't be easy. Nothing ever had been. But something had shifted in her during the fire. She had risked herself, not because she was told to, not because she owed anyone, but because she wanted to preserve something sacred. That choice made her feel alive in a way no rescue ever had. That night, they camped near the river under stars dulled by lingering smoke. Isaac sat by the fire, the children asleep nearby, and Clara beside him, the hawk carving in her lap. "You saved something that mattered," he said. "So did you," she replied. He turned to her, his voice rough with emotion. "You did more than survive Clara Mae. You chose to stay when you could have run." She smiled, faint but fierce. "I guess I finally found something worth staying for." The wind shifted. The smoke thinned. Above them, the stars blinked back into view, not brilliant but steady like promises whispered after long silence. They had lost a home. But not everything, because some things like journals, coins, and the courage to run into fire could never be burned away. The land was still scarred when they returned. The air carried a faint bitterness, as if the soil itself hadn't yet forgiven the fire. Clara Mae stood on the hill just above the blackened remnants of the cabin and felt the ash shift under her boots. Trees were now skeletal outlines against the sky, but the river still ran quieter than before, and beneath the soot the earth pulsed alive, waiting. They had spent 3 weeks at a neighbor's barn, sleeping on hay bales and surviving on borrowed food and compassion. Isaac had stayed silent most days, his hands always busy fixing building chopping. He was a man of motion when words wouldn't come. Clara, meanwhile, kept the children close like pieces of her own fractured soul, now stitched into a new whole. Each evening, she combed the girls' hair, mended the boys' socks, and listened as they whispered about home, about the swing, the garden, the scent of bread from the old wood stove. The fire had taken everything they'd made, but not everything they were. So when Isaac turned to her that morning, standing beside the empty wagon, and asked, "Are you ready?" she didn't hesitate. "Yes," Clara said, her voice low but unwavering. "Let's go back." They returned with very little, just a hammer, a bag of nails, 3 blankets, and a loaf of hard bread. But Clara carried something stronger, the certainty that healing wasn't just about escaping the past. It was about choosing to remain, to rebuild, to claim a place, not because it was perfect, but because it was yours. The first thing they rebuilt wasn't the house, it was the garden. Clara found the patch of soil where she'd once planted onions and herbs. She knelt, brushed aside ash, and pressed her palms into the dirt. It was dry, but not dead, and like her, it only needed someone to believe it could grow again. Isaac brought water from the river. The children gathered stones to mark the borders. Clara worked with quiet ferocity, sowing hope back into the ground with every seed. Each night they slept under a tarp, stars overhead, wind whispering through the grass like lullabies from another time. It should have been miserable. It wasn't. Because laughter returned first. The children found a way to play, even in the dirt. Isaac began carving again small animals from the burnt stumps around the ridge. Clara sang as she stirred stew over a fire. Soft songs, ones her mother had sung, ones she hadn't dared to hum since girlhood. And then came the moment she never saw coming. A stranger rode into the clearing. Clara was sweeping ash from the new foundation when she looked up and froze. The man was well dressed, his boots-polished hat crisp out of place amid their soot and sweat. She knew him before he spoke. The tilt of his head, the way his eyes scanned her like a ledger. It was her ex-husband. He stepped down from the horse slowly. His voice trembled just enough. "Clara, I heard about the fire." Isaac was beside her in seconds, arms crossed, not a word spoken. The children stopped playing. The man looked thinner than she remembered. His clothes no longer looked regal, just tight. His eyes searched her face like he expected to see something familiar. But there was nothing left of the woman he'd abandoned. "I came to say I was wrong," he said. "About everything. You were always good to me. I see that now." Clara didn't speak. "I thought I needed a wife who could give me children. But you raised 4 that weren't even yours. That has to mean something." Still, she was silent. He took a step forward. "We could try again, start over. I've done well for myself. You wouldn't have to live like this." Isaac didn't move. Clara did. She stepped forward, slow and certain, every inch of her shaped by ash and fire, by healing and work. "Do you remember," she said, "the day you let your mother call me broken?" The day you let them throw me out like I was a dog that couldn't hunt." He swallowed. "I do," Clara continued. "And I remember who picked me up off the road, who never asked what I couldn't do, only what I wanted to share." She turned back toward the clearing, toward the children playing tag between burned-out stumps. "I live like this," she said, "because it's honest, because every scar here has been earned, because love here isn't traded, it's grown." She walked past him. He called after her, voice smaller now. "Clara, please." But Isaac was already at her side, the hawk carving in his hand, offering it without a word. She took it and didn't look back. That night, after the stranger was long gone, Clara sat by the fire, staring into the flickering flame. Isaac passed her a mug of pine tea and settled beside her shoulder, brushing hers. "I thought you might go," he said, voice low. "I did too," she replied, for one breath. He looked at her, and now she turned to him, fully eyes steady. "I've run from too many places, but here, I didn't run. I stayed." The silence between them wasn't empty. It was full of all the things they hadn't said and didn't need to. The wind rustled through the young shoots in the garden. The stars blinked overhead. And Clara Mae, once sold, once cast aside now, sat at the heart of a home being born from ash. Not because she was rescued, but because she chose to stay. Years passed like wind through wheat, sometimes harsh, sometimes soft, always moving. The cabin grew again, plank by plank, each board nailed with hands that had once trembled but now held steady. Clara Mae and Isaac built slowly without blueprints, using what the fire hadn't taken and what the earth still gave. The walls smelled of pine and persistence. The roof held out the rain, and the windows let in the sun like a promise. But it was the garden that made the house a home. It had started with nothing but stubbornness and memory, a patch of land Clara refused to let die. She planted it before the floors were finished, before the beds were built. In that soil she buried seeds like prayers. Mustard greens, beans, corn. She planted hope with every knuckle she pressed into the dirt. Children helped. Isaac helped. And something unspoken grew between them with every root that took hold. The garden bloomed in crooked lines and wild color. It didn't care for symmetry or control. It spilled over rocks, wound around fence posts, climbed to the trees like it had always belonged there. It became something more than food. It became proof. Proof that life returned, that love endured, that even what is cast aside can rise again. One afternoon, Clara stood at its edge, a basket in her hand, her dress stained with soil and sweat. A little girl tugged at her skirt, her granddaughter, freckled, sharp-eyed, born with lungs that roared and fingers always reaching. "What's this one called, Grandma?" she asked, pointing to a bright yellow bloom curling toward the sky. Clara crouched, brushed her hand over the petals. "That's marigold. It keeps the bad things away." The girl nodded solemnly. "Like you do." Clara smiled. Her hands, though worn, still smelled of rosemary and thyme. As more grandchildren came, the garden became their playground, their classroom, their sanctuary. Clara taught them how to dig gently, how to water early before the sun bit too hard, how to sing to the tomatoes if they refused to ripen. Each child learned something different, but they all knew one rule: don't step on the cornflower path. That narrow line of delicate blue was sacred. It had been her mother's favorite. Now it was hers. And beneath those flowers Isaac had once found her quilt. Isaac aged quietly, his hands stiffened and his back bent further each year. But his eyes never dimmed. He carved less. But when he did, the figures were finer, a mother hen, sheltering chicks a tree, bent from wind but unbroken. One day, Clara found him setting up a small wooden arch at the edge of the garden. It was simple, nothing grand, just 2 beams with a plaque nailed between them. She stepped closer, brushing sawdust from her apron. "What's this?" He looked up, his face weathered like bark. "Something I've been meaning to do." She read the plaque. 3 words carved in Isaac's unmistakable hand, "The Garden of Clara Mae." For a long moment she couldn't breathe. Her throat tightened, eyes stung. "You named it," she whispered. "I didn't," Isaac said. "It named itself." He reached for her hand, not as a habit, but as a vow. "This place wouldn't grow without you. These children wouldn't have laughed. I wouldn't have lived." Clara rested her head against his shoulder. The garden rustled around them, full of unseen birds and whispering bees. The land remembered what had once been ash. When Isaac passed, he did so quietly, just as he had lived. One morning, Clara brought him his tea and found him sitting on the porch, the sun rising behind him, his hands resting on a carving of a hawk mid-flight. She buried him beneath the oldest tree at the edge of the garden, the one they'd hung wind chimes from their first year back. The children placed flowers. The grandchildren placed toys, and Clara placed her hand on the earth and whispered, "You gave me roots." She added a stone with his name, and beneath it in letters smaller but no less important, he built love with no blueprints. Clara lived many more years. She walked the garden each morning even when her knees protested. She told stories to every child born into the family, stories of fire and rebuilding, of silence, and songs of how a man with quiet hands once saw a woman no one else would touch and said, "She's still breathing." That's enough. When Clara died, she asked for no monument, just a seed planted in her name. They gave her more than that. The family buried her beside Isaac under the same tree, and above them they built a bench. On it was carved a simple phrase, the one Isaac had once whispered under his breath when he thought no one was listening. She gave birth to everything that ever mattered. Visitors still pass by the ridge. They come to see the garden not because it's grand, but because it refuses to die. Even in drought, something always grows. Even in silence, something always sings. They read the sign, they walk the cornflower path, they sit on the bench, and they whisper her name, Clara Mae. Not because she was famous, not because she was powerful, but because she stayed. And in staying, she made something that could never be sold. Something that grew. Something that healed. Something that to this day still blooms. 10 years had passed since Clara Mae was laid to rest beneath the old wind chime tree, but the garden still bloomed. Each spring the cornflowers came back fragile blue against stubborn earth. Children played along crooked rows of beans and mustard greens. Visitors stopped to walk the path she once built with blistered hands and unwavering heart. They whispered her name like a prayer. But one April evening, as shadows stretched across the ridge, a stranger arrived. He came on foot, an old man with a limp, his cane thudding soft against the dirt. His clothes were worn, but his posture unbowed, his jaw tight, his eyes scanning every face as if searching for a ghost he feared had never existed. Ruth, now the garden's caretaker and keeper of Clara's legacy, stepped from the porch. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked. He nodded slowly. "I'm looking for Clara Mae." Silence. A little girl nearby spoke first. "She passed away, a long time ago." The man didn't react, not right away. Then, wordlessly, he reached into his coat and pulled out an envelope. Yellowed with time. On the front, "Clara Mae, if you are still alive," written in a trembling, careful hand. Ruth took it with reverence. Her eyes scanned the name, then lifted to his weathered face. "Who are you to her?" He swallowed hard. "Her brother." Gasps rustled through the garden like wind through cornstalks. "I was sold off when I was barely 5, he said. My mother hid Clara's birth from the traders. I didn't even know she existed until last year when I found a letter from our mother hidden in a carved wooden hawk she left me before she died. She told me to find Clara. If she still lived. He paused. She said, Clara loved cornflowers. Ruth stepped aside without a word and gestured to the path behind her lined with blue petals glowing in the dusk. She walked beside him as they passed under the arch labeled the Garden of Clara Mae, past the tomato vines and worn bench, past the place where generations had planted hope. They moved in silence toward the wind chime tree, where two simple stones rested side by side. He stopped at Clara's grave. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he lowered himself to his knees with great effort, one hand pressed to the soil. I'm sorry, little sister, he whispered. I'm so damn sorry I came too late. Tears slipped down his face, caught in the corners of eyes still too sharp for age to dim. Children gathered nearby, hushed, watching something sacred unfold. Ruth handed him a leather-bound book, Lena's journal, now passed down and added to by Clara's many descendants. She left this to us. She said if family ever came real family, they should add their story too. Because this journal isn't just words, it's the root of everything. He turned to the final page where blank lines waited. In hands knotted with time, he wrote, My name is Joseph Boone, brother to Clara Mae, separated before memory, reunited by love not time. She built what no man ever could, and I kneel here today not because I knew her, but because I will never forget her again. He shut the journal and placed it gently at the base of the tree. Ruth crouched beside him. You can stay here if you want. Joseph looked around at the garden, at the laughter, the soil, the wind humming through chimes Clara once hung. I have nowhere else, he said. But here I have her. If this story moved, you don't just let it end here. Subscribe to our channel to help us bring more stories, like Clara Mae's, to life tales of the Wild West, not just filled with bullets and bandits, but with women who planted something deeper than roots. Like, share, and subscribe, because some stories aren't told, they're passed down, and they bloom forever.